Welcome to Eye on the Cure, a podcast from the Foundation Fighting Blindness, providing science research, news, and insights about the world of vision and blinding diseases.
Welcome, everyone, to the Eye on the Cure podcast. I'm your host, Ben Shaberman with the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And my guest for this episode is Lindsey Rambo, who, first and foremost, is a wife, a mom, a special education teaching assistant, and an athlete and a runner. As a fellow runner, I'll give you a fist pump. I love the running. But what's so relevant to this podcast, Lindsey was diagnosed with Leber congenital amaurosis, specifically LCA5, and is a participant in the LCA5 gene therapy clinical trial launched by Opus Genetics. And excitingly, Lindsey has had meaningful vision improvements from the treatment and was even featured on Good Morning America to share her story. Lindsey, I'm so delighted to have you on the podcast to share your story and tell us what it was like to be in the LCA5 gene therapy clinical trial.
Thank you so much, Ben. It is a true honor and privilege to be here and to get to have a conversation with you as a longtime listener of Eye on the Cure and a member of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. This really means so much to have this opportunity.
Well, it means a lot to us. The feeling is mutual, and I can't wait to get our conversation started. But before we begin, I want to give a little background on the LCA5 gene therapy clinical trial. Impressive vision improvements have been reported in the trial. It's in phase 1/2. And the trial has dosed 6 people. And Opus Genetics expects to adapt the current trial to include a phase 3 arm. And that means the company won't need to launch a separate phase 3 clinical trial. And that saves time and it saves money. So the LCA5 gene therapy trial is the first launch by Opus. And Opus is a company established by the Foundation's RD Fund. The RD Fund is our venture philanthropy arm, and the RD Fund is an investor in Opus Genetics. Okay, so Lindsey, let's start talking about your diagnostic journey. Your family, your parents knew that you had some vision issues when you were just a baby, but it took a while to get the diagnosis. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey? Although you were a baby, so you don't remember it, I'm sure.
Sure. Yes, Ben. So actually, my grandparents had noticed that I would fixate on overhead lighting as an infant. And they mentioned to my parents as they were preparing to go to an upcoming 8-week appointment at the pediatrician that they thought maybe I couldn't see well or I was blind. And so my parents brought it up at the pediatrician appointment, and I was referred to a pediatric ophthalmologist in Catonsville, Maryland, where I received the diagnosis of disease of the retina. And I guess that would have been in January of 1989. So that was a very broad diagnosis at that point. And I went through MRIs and CAT scans in that first year of life to rule out any other underlying issues or medical concerns. And they just determined that I had this unique visual impairment, and I was prescribed glasses at 10 weeks old. And that was kind of where I got started with my diagnosis. And it wasn't until I was probably 28 or 29 when we actually determined through genetic testing at the National Eye Institute at NIH that I had a deficient gene, and it was LCA5, or Leber's congenital amaurosis 5. And I had several diagnoses in between those periods, one being cone rod dystrophy when I was 16, And then when I was probably 24 or 25, it was in 2013. And it was actually my first trip to Philadelphia to go to Shea Eye Institute. I met with Dr. Jacobson and went through a lot of different testing that day. And Dr. Jacobson said that I had a rare form of retinitis pigmentosa. So I've actually kind of narrowed it down throughout my life. And only recently did I learn exactly what the diagnosis was through genetic testing.
Right. And it's interesting because when you were born, that time around 1989, we were just starting to discover the genetic causes of these conditions. The first gene for any inherited retinal disease was actually discovered in 89. So that's why it took you so long to get a definitive diagnosis. And I'll add now that if someone is born with significant vision loss, they can probably get that genetic diagnosis in a period of weeks or months. So we've come a long way, but I'm glad they got to the bottom of your condition. And when you were growing up, how do you feel the low vision, the vision impairment affected how you went about your schooling, your interaction with other kids, activities? Because you're a pretty athletic person.
Yeah, so that's a great question. When I went into school, I actually went to kindergarten when I was 4 years old because I had a December birthday and was able to go in early. And my parents had talked about possibly holding me back, but I think that I was pretty eager to get started. And they thought if I was ready, then they would let me go. And I went through school with minimum accommodations, and I learned in the general education environment with my typically sighted peers, and I used a handheld magnifier, large print textbooks, and I usually was positioned close to the board, the chalkboard back then. It was a whiteboard by the time I got to high school. But I really never could see from my seat if we were taking notes or something. As I was getting older, I was permitted to go up to the board and, take my notes. But I usually didn't do that because I thought it would draw attention to myself. So I became a really good listener. And when the teacher was talking, I would usually take notes and have things written down before we were even at the point of copying it off the board. So that was one of the tricks that I learned, or an adaptation that I had learned because of my visual impairment. And I had glasses, but I never thought that they worked very well for me. So by the time I was in high school, I didn't use them anymore. And like you said, I have been a lifelong athlete. I played soccer competitively throughout my whole childhood, and I played basketball and I ran track. So, all of those sports required a, high level of vision. So I did have some vision. It was always restricted. I was considered legally blind throughout my life. However, I think I just learned how to make the most of the little bit of vision that I had. And I'm a long distance runner now, and I run independently and, kind of outside of our neighborhood in different times. So I've been very fortunate to be able to adapt to different situations throughout my life. I think the biggest thing that kind of set me apart and really, I would say, was the hardest part of growing up with a visual impairment was learning that I wouldn't be able to drive. And that was more of a personal decision. Like, I was qualified to get my daytime license when I was 16. And I started going through the training for that program. And I just became very, very stressed and overwhelmed every time I got into the car. One, I had a tough time seeing a red light and a green light because those colors looked very similar to me. So it was hard for me to tell, especially if it were a sunny day. And another thing was I had very restricted visual fields. So I remember driving during that training and thinking, what if a child was playing in their driveway and their ball rolled out into the road and I wouldn't see that child come out after the ball? So that was like the deciding factor for me that I was not going to be a driver. And that was the hardest part of having that visual impairment and being legally blind growing up, because all my other friends were getting their license and they were wonderful. I mean, they would take me places too, and I'd always have a ride anywhere that I needed to go, but there's just something different about being able to get in your own car and drive whenever you want, wherever you want. So that was something that definitely was a challenge for me growing up.
Certainly. And that's a story we hear so much from kids with either RP or another retinal disease. Everybody wants to get their license. It's a rite of passage and it gives you freedom. But I really salute you for knowing right off the bat that it wasn't a good idea. I don't know that everybody has that level of maturity to see that it could have been a safety issue. So as you're growing up, you're getting into high school, did you notice changes in your vision? Was your vision pretty stable, or did the loss of vision progress?
Throughout my adolescence and teenage years, my vision was very stable. I really didn't notice my vision changing until I was in my mid to late 20s. And that I recognized as we were coming inside from like a really bright sunny day, and we were at an amusement park and we were going into like a really dark, dim lit ride. And I had to, for the first time, hold on to Zach as my human guide, and Zach's my husband. And my eyes never adjusted. So I had my first experience of, feeling totally blind with no light perception in that moment. And I just remember feeling scared, and because I had never believed before that I would ever lose my vision. But that was the big turning point for me at that point. But other than that, it had been pretty stable throughout my young adult life.
Right. And you seemed to move forward in life pretty well with some accommodations. You mentioned those, but you made it through college, you got married, you've been working. How has that been? Has your family or your workplace needed to help you adapt and accommodate your vision loss?
So when I was ready to go to college, I had stayed at a community college after I graduated high school, and that was local, and I had support of my family to kind of get me to and from. I was still living at home at that point. But when I earned my associate's degree at that point, and then when I went to a 4-year college, I transferred out to Frostburg State University to work towards my teaching degree for health and physical education. And at that point, I became connected with DOORS, which is the Division of Rehabilitation Services in Maryland. And they were able to help provide funding for me as I went to college. They got me connected with the disability services at Frostburg State University. So I would always have an accommodation letter to go along with me when I was going through college the whole way through. And usually, like before I would go to my classes for the first time, I would take a tour with someone who had typically sighted vision. And I would go and figure out where all my classrooms were and everything. So then the first day of school, I wouldn't get lost or anything like that. But there were definitely struggles. I feel like I really got a taste of having independence and freedom when I transferred to Frostburg and I started living on my own. It was my first time being away from my family. And I was able to just walk everywhere. And I loved that because when it was time to go to class, I went to class. Like I didn't have to rely on someone to take me in a vehicle, which I've always been so grateful to have that support. But again, it just nothing beats that independence that you gain whenever you're able to take yourself to and from somewhere. So I did really well in college. I really thrived and I loved it so much. I did a lot of college. I graduated with a bachelor's degree from Frostburg and I got my teaching certification for health and physical education in Maryland. But we had our first son at that time. And so I decided to be a stay-at-home mom for him. And then his little brother came shortly after, about less than 2 years after. And I just kind of wanted to be home with both of them until they started school. So when they were both in school full time, I went back to school to to earn my master's degree because I wanted to get a job as a teacher of the blind and visually impaired. So I went back to school, earned my master's degree in like 15 months and had it in special education. And immediately after that, I became a teacher of the blind and visually impaired in the district that we were living in. And I worked there for several years. And then I stepped away from that full-time position because I was presented with the opportunity to do the LCA5 clinical trial. And then I took on a part-time role for George Mason University, which is another master's degree that I had worked on for a specialization in teaching the blind and visually impaired. And then at that point, I worked there for a while and I earned this position that I'm in now in Virginia. And I've been doing that ever since. So I've kind of worn a lot of different hats, but I've always been in this realm of special education and, wanting to serve individuals with disabilities.
That's really impressive. Despite the vision loss, you were productive, you thrived, and I really congratulate you on that. So you have your husband, Zach, and is it 2 boys?
Yes, 2 boys, Lucas and Jackson.
Okay. We'll say hi to Lucas and Jackson. How did you meet Zach? Did you meet him in college?
Yeah, I mean, that was the best part of college. And Zach, I always have to say, like, he deserves all the credit for me to actually come to acceptance of my vision condition, because prior to him, I would not talk about it. Like I said, I tried to hide it as best as I could. I was pretty much in denial about it. It wasn't really talked about in my family. So when I met Zach, and I was 21 years old, and he was just so intrigued when I told him about my vision, and, he wanted to learn more about it. And it was just the beginning of this whole new world for me. I had met someone who really loved me for the thing that I did not love about myself. And so it was just the beginning of this beautiful story of getting connected with the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And he's actually the one who found the LCA5 clinical trial back in 2022. So I credit him 100% for everything with my improvements with my vision and my acceptance of it all, and to be able to sit here and talk to you about it, because if you would have known me 20 years ago, I would have never been able to sit here and talk about this.
Right, right. So a big shout out to Zach for being such a great partner and advocate and ultimately learning about the LCA5 gene therapy trial. And so what was that process like, deciding to check out the gene therapy trial and then making the decision to get the treatment? Was that an easy thing to do? What did it create a lot of anxiety?
Well, that's a good question, Ben. I have had a lot of time to think about whether or not I would ever participate in a gene therapy from the time that I learned that these kind of studies were going on, which was back in 2014 at my first vision walk in Baltimore. And that was the first time I ever felt hope that, wow, maybe I won't have to live my entire life with this vision. Like maybe there will be hope for others and myself for the future. And I just really clung to that. And I knew that one day, if that were to be the case and I'd be presented with that opportunity, I would take advantage of it because I knew there were so few clinical trials and studies being done back then in 2014. I mean, we've come a long way since then, but I knew that it would be a real gift if I were given that opportunity, and I wouldn't want to waste that. And I know that there's so many other people who would just give anything to have the opportunity. So I just wanted to take advantage of it and do my part in contributing to the science and the research being done for the IRDs.
Right, right. And we're so glad you jumped in and participated. And when you made the decision to get the therapy, it's of course surgery. Getting the subretinal injection is not trivial. Were you anxious about it? Did you have some apprehensions? And what were you hoping for or expecting after the surgery?
So the only thing that I was really hoping for was to leave the surgery with the vision that I went into the surgery. And if there were no improvements in my personal vision, I had already accepted that I was going to be at peace about that because I knew that whether or not I had an increase in vision or I didn't have an increase, the investigators of the clinical trial would learn something and they'd be able to modify the treatment in some way to make it better for someone else coming along. So I knew that I was going to be okay. I knew I was in the best care in the world for, that type of surgery. And I just felt very much at peace throughout that process. I mean, I had a little bit of nerves just for like the general surgery, just because it's pretty common to feel that way when you're going to be put under for anesthesia. And other than that, I just was very much at peace and had my faith and hung on to that the whole way through.
Well, your courage is admirable. And of course, anxiety is so expected. So you go into the surgery, they put you under. What was it like to come out of the surgery, wake up, and was the recovery difficult?
Well, the worst part about the recovery for me and the literally coming out of the surgery was having to lay still on my back for 4 hours and not being able to move. As active as I am, that was really tough for me because I had spent most of the morning having to lay in a bed and wait for the surgery. So I felt like I hadn't got up and moved in a really long time. So that was pretty tough. And I do remember when I first woke up, I remember saying that my eye really hurt and could I have some Tylenol? And because I was in the recovery and not in the part where I would see Zach and everything, they said that they had to give me something stronger than that. And I didn't want that. I wanted to wait until I was able to have like an over-the-counter Tylenol or Advil or something like that. So eventually, about a half hour later, I went back over to the hospital to fully recover because I was transported from the hospital to Shea Eye Institute where the surgery actually occurred. So when I went back and was recovering with Zach and everything, I felt pretty good. I actually walked from the hospital back to our hotel. I was very determined that I was going to do that. And it was about a 2-mile walk. And of course, I held on to Zach because I had my left eye that was treated was bandaged up. And I had my big black sunglasses on and everything. So I really trusted Zach in taking me back and literally was going back to the hotel, not being able to see anything. So I felt good enough to do that then. And when I called my grandmother when we got back there and I told her I was back and everything, she was not surprised at all when I told her that I walked back from my surgery and everything.
That is incredible. You walked 2 miles after getting this subretinal surgery. Did you actually tell your clinical team that you were going to walk back to the hotel? Did they know you were going to do that?
They had already left. I'm sure that I gave them a heads up. I don't know that they actually knew that I was going to feel well enough to do that. I know that the people at the hospital were trying to talk me out of it and everything, and I was like, I'm okay, I was holding on to Zach for balance and stuff, but I mean, if they would have let me, I would have ran back. But no, you can't do that kind of movement after you have that type of surgery. So,
well, certainly, you are unstoppable. So it sounds like you recovered pretty well from the surgery. No crazy side effects or anything. When did you notice your vision started improving? How long did it take after the surgery, and what did you notice?
So it was around a month after the surgery when, my eyes had become back to normal as far as being dilated and the air bubble and my treated eye had subsided. I had noticed the colors were a lot brighter, more vibrant. It was the fall, so I was seeing leaves, like we were driving along from a pumpkin patch and there were just so many colorful leaves on the mountains and everything. And I just remember them just seeming so vibrant and colorful and bright. And I also remember, this is a funny one. I had a pair of special pajama pants that I always loved to wear. They were so soft. And I always thought that they were like a white colored. And when I was getting them out of the laundry, I was like, oh my gosh, did I dye these pink or something? And I thought the colors had run. And I asked Zach, I was like, have these always been pink? I thought these were white. And he's like, no, they've always been pink. And I mean, I used to wear these things all the time. So I was able to distinguish that for the first time. And I think that was a good indicator for me. I was also able to reduce the size of my text on my phone, for text messaging or, browsers on the internet. And my Zoom window that I use on my iPhone and iPad, I was able to decrease the size of the magnification. And I was able to do that on my laptop as well. But I think the biggest one that I, continue to share when anybody asks me this question is that I was looking out the window and watching the children play in the cul-de-sac, and I was able to pick out my own children in the big group that was playing, and I was like, Zach, is that the boys? Is that Lucas? Is that Jackson? And I was able to pick them out, and I'd never been able to do that before. So that was really special for me whenever that moment happened.
Those are such wonderful anecdotes. Being able to recognize your kids from a distance, that must have been so overwhelming. And I know we talked about this before. You were able to put away your cane, right?
I was, yeah. Up until the surgery, I was using my mobility cane. And specifically, I used that whenever I was a teacher of the blind and visually impaired because I was itinerant, which meant that I went to my students. So some days I would be in, 5 to 7 schools in one day. And, I'm not like a normal everyday teacher in most of those schools. So I would use that as like a form of personal identification to let people know, like, hey, I can't see well. And also, like, for the students to know too, as they're scurrying along the hallways and everything. And then I would use it in public or if we were in an unfamiliar place. But I have not used my mobility cane since the surgery.
That's great. That's so great to hear. And so some time went forward, and then how did Good Morning America learn about you?
Well, it was actually through the foundation. It was the Beacon story that had been wrote about me over the summer and was shared in August for, I believe it was LCA week or month. I'm not exactly sure, but the Beacon story was shared, and then Opus Genetics actually saw my name through that, and they reached out to the research coordinator at UPenn where I do the clinical trial, and the coordinator reached out to me and said they would like to get in touch with me, but it was totally up to me, like, and I didn't have to tell UPenn if I were going to or not going to. It was all like I had to initiate it essentially. And so I reached out to the contact at Opus Genetics just to see, what they wanted to discuss. And, we started a partnership at that point as far as just communicating. And they wanted me to become like a patient advocate for them if I were willing to, and do some different types of things to get my experience out there with the clinical trial. And I said, of course, like I would love to do that because that's like my whole purpose is to raise awareness. I live my life to raise awareness and advocate for individuals with disabilities. And I would be thrilled and honored to be able to share my experience with everyone with this trial because it has, been such a blessing to my life. So one of the opportunities that Opus had brought to me was this Good Morning America segment. But when they first brought it to me, they were like, would you be willing to, talk about your experience on ABC News? And I was like, sure. And I was thinking it was like a local news. And they were like, okay, well, we'll be in touch with, the day or the time, and we'll work around your work schedule and all of that. So then later that evening, I got an email from the producer of Good Morning America. And I was like, oh my goodness, like I thought this was ABC News, like a local news segment. And this was the producer from Good Morning America saying like all rights are reserved for us, like until this airs. And I was like, oh my goodness, Zach, you're not going to believe this. So that's how that opportunity came about back in September, I think it was. And then we did the interview in late September, early October, and then it finally did air on Halloween on October 31st. And I was like, yeah, you guys made it in the last day of Blindness Awareness Month. So I was really excited about that.
That's a great story. And maybe it was good they didn't tell you it was Good Morning America until the very end, so you didn't have time to get too anxious about it.
Yes.
And it's such a great clip. And in the description of this podcast, I will make sure we provide a link to it so people can watch it or listen to it again. I know it got so much great visibility on social media, on the internet after it ran. We were all so excited to have you on national TV, and you did such a great job telling your story. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So through that story, you were able to kind of tell people out there what the gene therapy meant for you and a little bit about your background. And now with the Eye on the Cure podcast, a lot of the audience is patients and families and people from industry. And a lot of these folks are affected by vision loss or helping people who have vision loss. What is your message, given your journey, how you persevered regardless of the gene therapy, but then you did get the gene therapy? What is your message to people who are on a similar trajectory?
My first message would be to find a community, stay plugged in. For me, the Foundation Fighting Blindness had changed everything for finding a community because I never had that community of people surrounding me in terms of others with visual impairments or the resources that I've been connected to through the foundation. So I would say get involved with FFB and your vision walk and all that you can do to kind of soak up all the goodness and information that is available, and to be able to be a part of the My Retina tracker and be checking clinicaltrials.gov. These are all things that we did, Zach and I. And I would just say that, like, my disease, the LCA5, is such a rare vision condition, and you would not have thought that this disease would be studied. Like, you would think that there would be a study that's happening for a disease that impacts so many more people than this disease. So the fact that it has happened and I'm sitting here, have had my eye treated, it's just a miracle and a blessing. So always have hope and always be, learning and just kind of talking and connecting with others and filling your thoughts with this kind of podcast, like, to learn the information and to hear these kind of stories. It's just going to keep you going and keep you, having that faith to move forward and know that, your opportunity may come down the line. And I'm just so thankful to be able to speak to individuals who are considering clinical trials. And, I hope that opportunity does come for everyone.
Well, with more than 50 trials underway, we're definitely expanding the opportunities for people to participate. But Lindsey, I'm so impressed with your perseverance and your courage. You just keep moving forward regardless of the situation. And I'm so glad you got an opportunity to participate in a trial for a treatment that helped give you some vision back. Everybody deserves some vision back or saving their vision. And I'm glad you got that opportunity. And thank you for sharing your story. I know for me, I don't have a retinal disease, but when I talk to you and other people like you who have done such a great job at persevering and moving forward in your life, it truly is an inspiration, because we all have our challenges, our obstacles, and those days when things don't look so great, no pun intended, but your ability to persevere, your courage are truly inspiring. So thank you.
You bet. I appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your story, and thank you for being on the podcast. And as always, thank you, listeners, for joining Eye on the Cure. It's great to have you, and we look forward to having you back for the next episode.
This has been the Eye on the Cure podcast. To make an impact, donate now at fightingblindness.org.